What would you actually do if you had power? Not in theory, not in slogans, but in reality, with consequences. Would you expand the system or restrain it? Would you manage decline or attempt renewal? Because every government eventually faces the same question. Is power something to grow, or is it something to limit? If I were president, my guiding principle would be simple. End unnecessary conflict abroad, and rebuild strength at home, not through grand promises, but through restraint, through clarity, through choosing what not to do, because history suggests something uncomfortable. When a nation tries to do everything, it often loses control of the things that matter most. The first priority would be to end ongoing wars, not recklessly, not overnight, but deliberately, with the goal of bringing home American troops within 5 years. Because war has a pattern. It begins as necessity, becomes policy, and then becomes permanent. And once it becomes permanent, it reshapes the structure of power itself. I would reduce military spending significantly, not to weaken the country, but to align it with actual defense, not global management. At the same time, I would pursue agreements encouraging other major powers to reduce their own military spending, because peace is not just the absence of war, it is the absence of incentives for war. But ending war is only the beginning, because the question becomes, what do you do with the system that war created? I would launch a Swords to Plowshares initiative, transitioning soldiers into builders, investing in infrastructure, public housing, modern rail systems. The kind of projects that don't just move money, but create something real, something lasting. Because a nation that can build war machines can also build itself. Another pillar would be monetary stability. I would commission a serious review of the Federal Reserve, not to dismantle it overnight, but to understand how we move toward something more stable, something more grounded, possibly even a system where currency is tied at least in part to tangible value, like gold, because money is not just a tool, it is a signal. And when that signal becomes distorted, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. I would rethink America's role in the world, not through isolation, but through independence. That means reassessing long-term alliances such as NATO, reducing commitments that pull the country into conflicts that are not directly tied to its defense, maintaining diplomacy but avoiding entanglement, because alliances can sometimes expand conflict rather than contain it. At home, one of the most overlooked questions is land. Who controls it, and how is it used? The federal government controls vast amounts of land, much of it underutilized. I would review that land and make portions of it available for responsible development, excluding ecologically sensitive areas. This reflects a deeper insight discussed by James C. Scott, that centralized systems often fail to understand local realities, while people on the ground, farmers, builders, communities, often manage land more effectively because they live with the consequences, clearing fire hazards, maintaining stability, adapting over time. Because the difference is simple: abstract control versus lived knowledge. I would create a system where citizens can apply to develop land based on clear and responsible plans, with the goal of expanding ownership and lowering barriers to building a life, because a healthy society is not one where most people depend on distant institutions. It is one where ordinary people can own homes, own land, build businesses, and raise families, and possess a genuine stake in the communities they live in. Ownership creates responsibility, but it also creates independence, and a free society depends upon both. On immigration, I would pursue a balanced approach. A one-time pathway to citizenship for non-criminal residents already here, followed by clear enforcement going forward. At the same time, expanding legal pathways, requiring background checks, civil understanding, a willingness to assimilate, because the nation is not just a territory, it is a shared framework, and that framework requires continuity. Resources saved from war would be redirected toward public well-being, healthcare access, lower drug prices, and breaking the revolving door between corporations and regulators. I would support small farmers, encourage healthier food production, increase transparency around ingredients, and hold corporations accountable when they harm public health. Because the purpose of an economy is not just growth, it is the well-being of the people within it. On energy, I would again aim for balance, energy independence without environmental neglect, expanding nuclear energy, supporting cleaner technologies, and enforcing strict penalties for companies that pollute and harm communities. Because the environment is not abstract, it is where people live. In education, I would expand alternative pathways, allowing students to test out of classwork, recognizing ability over time spent, reducing cost barriers, because education should not be a gatekeeping system. It should be a path forward. The same principle applies more broadly. Economic mobility should not be reserved for those already positioned to succeed. The goal should be to make advancement easier, that not through dependency, but through opportunity. Taxation should be simple, transparent, and limited to what is necessary. I would pursue reforms that leave more income in the hands of working Americans, particularly those at the lower and middle levels of the income scale, because families generally know better than distant institutions how to use the fruits of their own labor. I would also seek a long-term path towards reducing and ultimately eliminating property taxes, because ownership should mean ownership. If a family has paid for its home, or a farmer has paid for his land, or a small business owner has paid for his property, they should not live under the permanent concern that they could lose it simply because they can no longer afford an annual tax bill. The effects would extend beyond homeowners. Lower cost for farms, lower cost for family businesses, and over time, lower costs that are ultimately passed on through rents and prices, because a society built upon ownership should encourage people to keep what they have earned, not merely rent it indefinitely from the state. But fiscal responsibility requires more than tax reform. It requires discipline. Any new spending should be offset by reductions elsewhere. Because a government that asks families to budget should be willing to budget itself. Debt can sometimes be necessary, but permanent dependence upon debt is simply postponing difficult decisions for future generations. I would close facilities such as Guantanamo Bay and prohibit practices like torture, because the way a government exercises power define what it becomes. There is another place where power reveals itself clearly, the justice system. The United States has one of the largest prison populations in the world, and that raises a deeper question. What is the purpose of punishment? Is it simply to punish, or is it to restore? I would begin by re-evaluating the use of incarceration for so-called victimless crimes. Because when punishment extends beyond harm, it risks becoming something else. Not justice, but control. But reform is not just about who enters prison. It is about what happens inside. Because too many people leave prison only to return. Not because they want to, but because the system has not prepared them to do anything else. I would shift the focus toward education, skill building, rehabilitation. Because a prison system that produces repeat offenders is not solving the problem. It is sustaining it. There are countries, particularly in Scandinavia, that have achieved far lower rates of reoffending, not by abandoning accountability, but by designing systems that prioritize reintegration, because how a society treats its prisoners reflects what it believes about human potential. And if the goal is a safer society, then outcomes matter more than punishment alone. Finally, I would treat mental health as a national priority, expanding access to healthcare, encouraging practices like exercise and meditation, and exploring emergent treatments for depression and addiction. Because a stable society is not just built on institutions, it is built on people who are able to function, think, and live well. The ultimate goal is not merely a smaller government, nor a larger one. It is a healthy society, one in which people are capable of owning, building, contributing, and governing themselves. At its core, this vision is not about control. It is about limits, because the lesson that appears again and again in history, in politics, in systems, is that power tends to expand. War expands it. Crisis expands it. Even good intentions can expand it. It is whether it is ever brought back, because a nation that projects power outward endlessly often loses balance inward. And renewal does not come from doing more, it comes from doing less, more carefully, more deliberately, with an understanding of what should never have been expanded in the first place. And of course, I don't expect everyone to agree with these ideas. Some of them may be wrong, some may be incomplete, and some may have consequences I have not considered. But after years of reading history, economics, political philosophy, and watching governments operate, these are the conclusions that I've arrived at. Not because I think they are perfect, but because they seem, to me, more likely to create a peaceful, stable, and free society. But that's only my view, so I'd like to hear yours. What would you do if you were president? What do you think I've gotten right? What do you think I've gotten wrong? And what changes would you make? Because I think in these times, the people themselves need to start thinking and taking action in our government more than ever, because those who are our current political class is degenerate and doing a horrible job, and it's time we take over and step in as much as possible. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear them. Thank you for watching.